Hi, everybody. This is the beginning of our new book study here at Dormition. We're reading the Trial of Job by Father Patrick Henry Reardon, and we'll be working through it a few chapters at a time. And tonight we're going to start with the introduction and go through chapter 3, hopefully. And the way that we typically do this is question and answer and a little bit of discussion. So, without further ado, and the prayers of all the saints, let's begin. As usual, if you have any questions out there, feel free to type them into the comment box, and I'll do the best I can to get to them. So, beginning with the introduction, what genre of literature is the book of Job? Wisdom literature, which is a particular genre of literature among the various types that are used in the Old Testament. History, poetry, wisdom, etc. Within wisdom literature, there are subdivisions. What kind of wisdom literature is the book of Job?
We didn't find the answer. We found he called it speculative. I don't know if
that's right. Speculative wisdom literature. So, Father Patrick identifies two basic types of wisdom literature. And the first, which is the larger body of literature, and by far the more common, is what they call practical wisdom. In other words, it's the kind of aphoristic advice that is passed down father to son, mother to daughter, generation to generation, about how one gets on or lives in society. The other kind, this speculative wisdom literature, tries to tackle questions that are left completely unaddressed by the more practical wisdom. Questions of why innocent suffering happens. How do we parse that out? What kind of responsibility does God have? How do we respond to Him? So all of that is characteristic of the speculative wisdom literature, of which Job is a part. What is the book of Job about?
I think that why I thought it would be good to study this book is it's about man's relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the heart of the matter.
Anything else? Come on in, please. I have some people coming in. I'm streaming live to Facebook for the people who can't be here.
Well, it's about justice. It's about theodicy. It's a great word. That's what this whole thing is about, theodicy.
The whole thing is about the justice of God and theodicy. Specific to the main character, it's about the trial of a just man. It's about the trial of a blessed man. So you recall how at the beginning of the book he talks about how the beginning of Job parallels the beginning of the book of Psalms. Psalm 1, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, who sits not in the way of sinners, nor stands in the seat of the scornful, that kind of thing. Job begins in the same way. It's the articulation of the life of a blessed man. And the book of Job is really going to be all about the trial of such a blessed man.
Is Psalms considered part of the wisdom literature?
Yes, Psalms is in places wisdom literature, though it's not the dominant form. Psalms, more than wisdom literature, Psalms reflects the hymnographic tradition of the Hebrew people. A lot of it is literature, so poetry, hymnography, and some wisdom.
And was Psalms written over a long period of time? I was trying to figure out, Psalms was written before Job, I guess, right?
Yeah, more than almost certainly yes.
But I don't really know when Psalms, not all of the Psalms were written by David. Right?
No, certainly not all the Psalms were written by David, and the collection, of course, as is finalized, almost all of the books that we have were collated after the Babylonian exile. We don't know all of the authors, but it is a collection made by a number of authors over a significant period of time, at least as we have it now. So Job is about the trial of a righteous man. What is the most important feature of Job's character, according to the prophet Ezekiel?
Well, we looked that one up. I didn't remember the answer, but what we found was that it was intercession is what it says. Intercession.
Intercession.
Not what I was expecting.
It isn't what you're expecting. It's right there on the page when you read it, when you read the story of Job, but you tend not to notice it because of the much more dramatic features of the story of Job. You tend to focus on his long-suffering patience, which Father Patrick talks about. You tend to focus on, the dramatic courtroom kind of encounter in heaven between God and the devil, and those kinds of details. But Father Patrick points out that Ezekiel, the prophet, when he mentions Job, he mentions him as the sine qua non of intercession. That's the key to his character is his intercessory activity. Job rises early in the morning to intercede for his sons and his daughters, for his family. And at the end of the book, he intercedes again at the command of God himself. He intercedes for his friends so that God would not be angry with them, because God apparently was even more annoyed with his comforters than Job himself was. So this is something you want to bear in mind as we go through the book and we consider the testing of Job. How that bears on this essential function of his character. How is time divided in the book of Job? Thank you.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I was reading some Hebrew materials about Job accidentally, not related to this, before we started this study. And I remember very well in one big part of the study, they mentioned that Job was not a believer of God. He was not known to God. He was perfect and righteous, but he didn't believe in God. So how can he be intercessor where he doesn't believe in God? I mean, at that time there was no God. God never revealed himself to nobody.
Well,
This is what the study mentioned or said about this time.
Father Patrick mentions at the beginning that Job is not a Hebrew.
Yes.
So Job represents,
Gentiles.
he represents he's the epitome of a righteous non-Jew. A righteous man who is not part of the covenant, but nonetheless embodies all of the characteristics, the qualities of one who is righteous before God, one who is part of the covenant. Literarily, this is a significant feature of the story, because you have this non-Jew being held up for Jews in their own literature as an example of what it means to be righteous. I think it's interesting that they would have chosen to include him as a non-Jew when it would have been easy enough to tweak the story a little bit to make him a member of the covenant, but they don't. And I think that's because there's always that element of friction that it creates. You hold up before these Jewish boys and girls who are learning these stories from a very early age, the epitome of someone who is not part of the covenant, who is nonetheless embodies righteousness. And it serves as a sort of a challenge. If the non-Jew can do so much, can you not at least rise to that challenge? So it puts a lot of pressure on the covenant hearer that I think is intentional. It's deliberate. But it isn't true that they know of no God. It says at the beginning that Job worships God. And the presumption is that somehow or another he has a relationship with the one true God that exists outside of the normal parameters that one would expect to find that in. This is not surprising when you consider that that's pretty common to our experience. Our experience as Orthodox Christians is that we often find people outside of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church who nonetheless embody the characteristic qualities of an Orthodox Christian or of a person who has a relationship with God. And when we encounter that, either we have to say, it's all a fake. They're like the Pharisees, they're casting out demons by the prince of demons himself, or we have to say that maybe God is doing something that we don't fully understand. So it's Job is certainly not a covenant member of the nation of Israel, but he certainly, according to the literature here, has a real relationship with the one true God. Because God says, have you considered my servant, Job? My servant.
Is he a contemporary of Abraham?
No. I mean, it's hard to know. One thing we want to bear in mind as we read this book is that we are reading a work of literature. Now, that doesn't mean that it didn't really happen. What it does mean is that the book itself is not set up to answer our historical kinds of questions. That's not what the purpose is. And so the book isn't going to function very well on a historical record kind of way. As a piece of literature, it's intended to provoke and answer different sorts of questions, and it's constructed in a way to sort of clue the reader into how to read it. And so there's no way to answer that question definitively, but the book itself is not going to help us a whole lot in that regard.
One of the interesting things about Job not being a Jew is that in the last speech that he makes where he justifies himself, he doesn't say what a Jew would say, which is, I've kept all the commandments, because that wasn't part of his culture. Instead, he says things like, I haven't gone past a beggar without giving him some money, or I haven't ignored widows and orphans, or he goes through all of these things that are sort of a general morality that applies to a lot of different cultures, but not specifically Jewish.
Yeah, it's if you couldn't hear the comment, one of the people said that it's interesting to note that when he gets to the end and he's justifying himself before God, Job doesn't say the things that a Jew would say about having kept the commandments. Instead, he talks about very generic sort of things that are common to the morality of a lot of ancient cultures. And so this is interesting to note. And yet, God refers to him as his servant. And God certainly blesses him as one of his own. So that's worth considering. So how is time divided, according to Father Patrick? How is time divided in the book of Job?
Essentially 3 periods. One before the situation where God and Satan take this action, and then after that, after Job 42.
Absolutely. So there are 3 basic periods of time, and they're divided very generically: before, now, and after. And the now of the trial of Job, which will comprise the bulk of our conversation, also makes up the bulk of the book. But then we get a snapshot of Job's life before that happens, and then we get a snapshot at the very end when we hear about how God restores his fortune at the end. And so there's a very clear before and after attached to this body of what's happening in the middle, the trial of Job. There's a very clear before and after. Which is important. because it parallels the what does he talk about? The parallel with the trial of
Abraham?
The trial of Abraham. It's structured along the same lines as the trial of Abraham. Excuse me. How does Father Patrick characterize the middle time, the time of Job's trial?
Well, literarily, it's a poem.
That's right. Literarily, it's a poem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Qualitatively.
I have a question. Always comes to my mind. Why God allowed David to test him? Why? He can tell him, I know my son.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want you to go through to test all his righteousness to approve what? To approve to the devil. He knows. Why he let Job go through all of that to prove it to the devil? He's not going to change. He knows. God knows.
That's one of the perennial questions that people ask when you get to the book of Job.
It's like I feel sorry for Job to go through that because the devil. Even the devil tested God on the mountain, and he told him no from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Throw yourself, no. Eat, no. He can do that to Job too.
Ask the question as a reader. Ask yourself that question as a reader. In other words, try to step back from thinking about Job himself to thinking about Job as you encounter him as a reader. What's the benefit? What's the benefit to us? God allowing him to go through this situation.
Because we're all going to go through it.
Well, we're all going to suffer. We're all going to struggle. There are always going to be trials. So on one level, it's pedagogical. It's instructive about the qualities of a righteous man. It is telling that Job, righteous though he is, servant of God though he is, gets very sad and depressed about his situation and says things like, I wish I'd never been born. So it's training you about suffering, and while it's not, so to speak, showing you how to respond, it's also stretching the boundaries of what is acceptable behavior in terms of suffering. Job never curses God, but he goes a long way toward letting God have an earful. And this is something that will be characteristic of Hebrew culture all the way through the Scriptures, is that they have a relationship with God that is real enough, that is confident and solid enough, that they're not afraid to give God an earful when things are really tough. There's a line, there's a limit you don't cross.
Yeah.
But it stretches out a long way. So as a reader, it's training you in a variety of ways. On another level, and remember, we'll talk about apocalyptic literature, there's always more than one answer to the question. On another level, and he talks about this, Father Patrick does a little bit later on, God is mocking the devil. He is holding him up to shame. He's humiliating him in front of all the sons of God. So the sons of God, of course, we know, are the angels. Especially the high angels, the archangels, the principalities, the dominions. They're the sons of God. And so here, if you want to imagine a heavenly throne room with God on his throne and all of these angels gathered around him, and here comes Lucifer, the angel of light, also known as Satan or the accuser. And he comes and he brags before God about all of his mischief. And he asks him in front of all of these others, And he doesn't say that he comes alone. So maybe some of his own fallen angels are with him. We don't know. But he asks him about Job. And God, who knows everything, says, go ahead, see what you got. From the vantage point of God, he is mocking and humiliating his archenemy, the one who would try to be his equal, in front of all of the heavenly host. And he's also mocking him in front of all of us who read it and witness his failure and Job's restoration, Job's justification. So there's a lot going on different levels to answer that question. But a lot of it has to do, again, with coming at it, trying to keep in the front of your mind that you're coming at it as a reader, and how this works as a story that you're reading. Again, that's not to deny that it really happened, but the way that you're supposed, the most fruitful way to approach the story is as a story. So, the middle time of Job's trial is characterized as a time of
Trial.
testing. It's a time of testing. In other words, this is not punishment for something that Job did wrong. It's not the devil having his due or his day. The story very clearly lays out the terms on which this testing will be had. And it proceeds in a couple of stages in this first 3 chapters. The devil comes to him first and he says, oh, well, Job, he's only righteous because you let him have all the stuff he wants. I mean, he's got 10,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he's got children and grandchildren. If you took that stuff away from him, he'd drop you like a bad habit. So God says, okay. But it's interesting that God is the one who brought him up in the first place. When the devil comes there, have you considered my servant Job? So God is the one who pushes Job to the front here. And then the devil comes up with his plan. I'm going to take his stuff away. And God says, okay, take his stuff away. And he comes back and says, that didn't work. Oh, well, what else did you have in mind? You can almost see him smiling behind his. I said, well, if he had to suffer, I'm sure that would do it. I mean, nobody wants to suffer. Oh, well, I guess you could try it. See what you get. Just don't kill him. And so those are the terms that are laid out for this testing. But Father Patrick points out early on in the introduction that it is testing that proves that a blessed man is in fact a blessed man and not simply a wealthy man or a fortunate man. What sets Job apart from any other wealthy, a nomadic landholder in his time is simply the testing. That's how you know that he's a righteous man, is that he's tested. And when he's put to the test, he is proved true. And that's what makes him different. That's how you know. And so this is the middle time here is all a time of testing. And if we go back to that essential quality that we talk about from Ezekiel, Job's intercessory function, his power as an intercessor, it is really this essential function that is trying to be wrested from him in this time of testing. If Job's relationship with God is sundered, if he rejects God, curses God, absolves himself of his status as a servant, then he can no longer stand before God and intercede. Because if you're not with God, the only way you stand before him is as Lucifer does, an accuser, a hostile force. That's right. Someone on the Facebook page says it also shows things like God's confidence in us to be faithful. This time of testing, and Father Patrick does mention that in a couple of places. that while the devil is always a cynic, take his stuff away, he won't serve you. Take his health away and he won't serve you. God's always an optimist. I think you will. Why don't we see? God's always optimistic about Job's faithfulness. And it's interesting, I think, that he's always optimistic about our faithfulness too. In that he always, when we come to him in repentance, restores us. There is no provision in the Orthodox tradition for a person to come to confession and for the priest or the bishop to say, oh, you can't be forgiven for that. There are certain things that require a little bit more effort, but there's nothing that one cannot be forgiven for. And so God is always optimistic about the possibility that we ourselves will be faithful. So this is a very nice insight. What importance do numbers have when considering the before and after of the story of Job?
Well, he replaces his children, but he doubles everything else that he lost.
He replaces his children, but he doubles everything else. And St. Gregory, highlighting this, that everything is exactly doubled. And it's interesting, even his life. There's 70 years up to this point, and then he lives 140. So his lifespan is doubled. His possessions, his lands, his cattle, everything is doubled. And Gregory highlights this to say that this is indicative of the, I'm going to use a big word here, the supersubstantial, the beyond this world blessings of the kingdom of heaven. That this represents the above and beyond, the exponential increase of the blessings of the righteous man in the kingdom of God. So now that we've kind of sketched out a few of the themes and some of the features from the introduction, let's move on to chapter 1. And we have about half an hour left, so that gives us 10 minutes for each chapter. So we have time for one tricky question or a whole lot of my really easy ones. So moving on to chapter 1. What does Job embody in the first chapter of the book? And we talked about this a little bit earlier.
A righteous man, a prosperous man?
The blessed man of Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in that law doth he meditate day and night. Job is the epitome, and I don't think this is accidental. Again, because this is literature that is read by Hebrew children, and you cannot underestimate the awareness they have of their own literature, their own knowledge of their own literature. So when Job is described as a blessed man, using the same, sometimes it just takes a couple of words. And intertextual scriptural studies really bring this out. That sometimes a whole passage or a whole story is referred to by simply a couplet or just a few words that are put together in the same way that's meant as a gesture to something else entirely without mentioning it explicitly. So we have an instance here of intertextuality. This blessed man of Job chapter 1 would automatically take your mind back to Psalm 1, where it describes the blessed man who is, of course, an Israelite. And so then you have this, it brings right away this tension to the front of your mind, that the blessed man described in Psalm 1 is embodied in Job 1 by a man who is not a Jew. And how's this going to work out? So automatically your interest and that dramatic tension is raised right at the beginning. I mentioned just a moment ago, because sometimes I get ahead of myself a little bit, that the sons of God that are mentioned at the beginning of the book are in fact the angels. And this is not at all it shouldn't be at all a surprising or revelatory detail. This is simply the way they're referred to in the Old Testament. The sons of God are the angels, and so when and this is mentioned in other places. Matter of fact, in other places they are also referred to as gods. God sits in the council of the gods, it says in another place. And these gods are the angelic hosts, particularly of the high rank of Lucifer and Michael and Gabriel, and Raphael and the others that are the highest ranking angels. So keep that in mind, not just for the book, but also for your reading in the Old Testament in general, that sons of God generally refers to the angelic powers. What is the argument that Satan makes to God concerning Job?
That he's only righteous because he has all the goodies.
That is right. That he's only righteous because he's got all the good stuff. How... I have some visitors coming here. So the presumption, again, reflecting Satan's cynicism, is that, like him, no one would bother to serve God unless they got something really good for it. Like, the only reason he's doing this is because you give him stuff. You know? So this, again, reflects Satan's cynicism. And that cynicism is rooted in his own rebellion. He didn't want to serve God. He wanted to be God. And he certainly didn't want to play second fiddle. So he has this rooted expectation about humans that, sadly enough, often proves to be true.
But it's not just Satan that thinks that. All of the friends do the same thing. When the friends show up and they start talking to Job, they say, if you're good, you get good stuff. If you're bad, you get bad stuff. So they're all keyed into the same system. They believe in the same system.
And again, if you couldn't hear it, he said it's not just Satan, it's also Job's comforters. When they arrive, they will make the same suggestions that if you do the righteous things, then God blesses you and gives you stuff, and if you don't, then you don't get good stuff. And what did you do wrong, Job, that you're now in this pickle? It's interesting, and this is a particularly interesting note. The Pharisees, indeed most of the nation of Israel, seem to be operating on much the same expectation in the New Testament. That righteousness means prosperity. And that a righteous man is prosperous and an unrighteous man is not prosperous. Think of the disciples when Jesus gives that rather startling passage about how it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And they respond, well, if that's the case, who in the world could possibly be saved? Because there's almost a correlation between righteous and successful or wealthy. But Job is explicitly, as you point out, undermining this causal relationship. He's explicitly calling that into question, not refuting it outright, but kind of putting a wrinkle in there, that maybe it's not always exactly like that. Maybe it's not straightforward. Maybe it's not that way consistently all the way across the border for all time. Maybe even the righteous man who is blessed suffers. And so that's a very interesting point that you bring up, that the comforters have the same expectations that the devil does. And these expectations are not entirely unjustified, because you find in the Psalms particularly this expectation sort of articulated, that the righteous man is blessed of God, that God preserves him in the face of his enemies. Well, Job isn't going to deny that, but he's certainly going to put a big caveat that this blessing, that this protection, that this shelter may have some gaps, that it may not be consistent across the whole experience of one's lifespan. So that's a very interesting thing to note. How is Job, and Father Patrick mentions this, but I don't think he goes into it a whole lot. How is Job the antithesis of Adam?
In his fidelity to God.
Mm-hmm. In his fidelity to God.
Remaining faithful under temptation.
Yep. It's also interesting that it starts backwards. Job is righteous and then tested and then found faithful. He starts off being the blessed servant of God, and then he comes to the crisis, and then he's found faithful. But death is already part of the picture. And this again, thinking of this as a story that is being read by Hebrews, connected to all the other stories that are part of their story. You're nuancing, in a very important way, the difference between the experience of righteousness and suffering, or righteousness and temptation in the garden, and everything that comes after it. Does that make sense? If Adam passes the test, death does not enter into the world. And that's a theological point that's made explicit by Paul when he says, by one man's sin entered into the world, and by sin death. And so, in Adam's testing, there is a possibility to preserve something that once lost can never be recovered as long as the world lasts. Job is, like Adam, pure. Now, of course, later theological reflection on Adam, excluding particularly Augustine, but including specifically Irenaeus and Simeon the New and Maximus, is going to say that Adam is pure but immature. He is inexperienced, he's unwise, he doesn't have a body of knowledge to draw on as he makes his choice. But he is nonetheless pure, not perfect, because perfection requires wisdom, but pure. Job is the same way. He is pure, he's righteous before God, but he has wisdom and experience. But his temptation still involves death and suffering in a way that Adam's does not. The death and suffering comes afterward for Adam. For Job, it's part of the temptation itself, and it's bound up in the whole of life. So the whole, if you want to say it this way, the terms of the debate have changed. And now Adam-likeness is played out on a level that necessarily involves suffering and death in a way that it did not in the beginning. So it's a lower level, and the possibilities are lower. Adam, had he passed the temptation, could have proceeded on to receive the eternal divine life of God without suffering and death. Though the fathers all say that Christ still would have come in some way, but he would not necessarily have had to have suffered and died. For Job, the blessings are temporal. They point to something more yet to come beyond the world, but the blessings are purely temporal. And so this is how Job and Adam are related and unrelated, and how Job nuances the expectations of blessedness, vindication, etc., outside of paradise.
There's another odd thing when you try to compare Job to the story of Adam and Eve, in that in the story of Adam and Eve, it's the devil that offers wisdom to Adam, okay? And wisdom is a bad thing here. You're not supposed to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it's when Adam does it that he ends up getting tossed out of paradise. Whereas here, it looks like wisdom is a good thing. There's this long chapter where Job talks about searching for wisdom, and in the end, what he gets, what comforts him, is knowledge that God exists. He gets to see God. So wisdom is part of his reward here. And it's God that gives him wisdom, it's not the devil. So I don't know what that means, but it is sort of the opposite. The stories are opposite as far as what wisdom means.
Yeah, in the garden, wisdom taken or attempted to be taken is promised by the devil and taken by Adam, and it's a bad thing. And here, wisdom is the fruit that Job gets from his faithful passage through this test, the encounter with God. Which is, wisdom is bad in the first instance and good here. And that brings us back again to the patristic commentaries on Genesis, which emphasize that the wisdom is a problem, is bad for two reasons. One, they try to take it by force. In other words, instead of waiting for God to give them, they try to wrest it for themselves. And two, they take it untimely, because they are in fact immature, unwise, inexperienced. They want to take something that can't be got the way that they're trying to get it. They can get knowledge, but knowledge without wisdom leads to a lot of trouble. And that's something that anybody who has children know. I can teach my 11-year-old the knowledge that it takes to drive a car. I can teach him how to turn the wheel and what pedal does what and how to put it in gear. He has no experience that would allow him to do that safely or well. And he's too young to get it. For one reason, he can barely see over the dash. So he could get the knowledge, but it would kill him before he got the wisdom. And that's the way the fathers often speak about Adam and Eve in the garden, is that they tried to take for themselves as an act of will, aggression, untimely, what God would have generously bestowed upon them through in due course. In other words, he would have walked with them in the garden, he would have taught them, continued to allow them to grow in knowledge and experience, and the wisdom would have come in time. But they tried to wrest it for themselves so that they could have autonomy. It's interesting here. What Adam and Eve want, what the devil promises them, is that if they take this, then they won't need God anymore. They'll have his own divine life for themselves. What Job wants more than anything is an encounter with God, because he can't think of himself as somehow separate of or equal to. The end result for Job is to meet God. The end result for Adam was to be God. Did anyone happen to read through the trial of Abraham? How is it similar to the trial of Job?
Well, I guess the biggest similarity that I saw was that what Abraham is asked to do is completely contrary to human notions of justice. At least that's the way I saw it. That the voice of God talks to Abraham, Abraham, take your son and sacrifice him. So you think to yourself, how can this possibly be a moral story? This is not an act that anybody would condone in modern society. And so it's similar to Job in that in the end, Job is wanting an explanation, and he wants God to conform to human notions of justice. And the answer, well, he doesn't really get an answer. But the answer that you're left with is that the same answer that God gives Moses. He says, "I will favor whom I will favor." And so, well, I guess that's the similarity.
The sort of the inscrutability of God is very much the same, even as both Abraham and Job bemusedly follow along as God takes them on this sort of alarming ride, doing the best they can to try to make sense of it. But both are also vindicated, and each has the thing restored to them that was taken. Abraham, it appears that he's going to have his son taken from him, and of course his son is restored to him. And Job's family is also restored to him.
I tell you though, almost.
Yeah, that doesn't help the first kids.
Doesn't help the first set of kids.
Nope.
First kids are gone.
First kids are gone. And that's really hard if you're thinking about this historically. Like, what about those people? When you're thinking about it as a story, you can feel a little bit less weight from that particular part of the narrative. But it's just something that we have to come to terms with as modern people, that the ancient world is a lot less shy about death, even unexplained death, or death that seems to serve no purpose other than to further a story, than we are. They're just not as uncomfortable with the reality of it as we tend to be. Though it doesn't. I mean, if you want to insert yourself into the historical drama, Job does sit in silence on ashes for a week. So very clear. It's very real to him in that way. And we're always tempted by the question, well, how is it fair for God to kill all those people for the sake of this story? God's not going to answer that question any more than he answers Job's questions. It's not something that is addressed in the story, and it's not something I think that people then would have stopped to ponder too much, especially if you're reading it literarily. Those are questions that are more prominent in our day. What differences emerge between the character of God and Satan in their dialogue concerning Job? And I talked about this a little earlier as well. God is an optimist regarding his servant Job, and maybe by extension, more people. And Satan is a cynic through and through. His assumption about human beings in general, and Job in particular, is very cynical, incredibly negative. That he only does what he does because he gets stuff. So now we have about, we ran over a little on our time, so we're moving on to chapter 2 now. What is Satan's goal for Job? What is Satan hoping to accomplish?
He wants him to curse God.
He wants him to curse God. Why does he want him to curse God?
That's because he wins the bet.
I mean, yeah, on one level, it's certainly because he wins the bet. He would be the one mocking God then. He could walk into the throne room among all the sons of God, and he could go, and let God have an earful. On the level of Job himself, what does that accomplish? If Job curses God, what happens?
His wife tells him God's going to kill him. That's what she says. She comes to him and she says, curse God and die.
Yeah.
And that would put him out of his misery. So
yeah,
it's a temptation to him.
And that's again that's the same voice. That's the voice of Satan. And even Jesus points out that sometimes people speak with the devil's voice when he corrects Peter. Get behind me, Satan. So it's interesting that is possible, that sometimes we see things the way he sees them and respond the way that he wants us to respond. It's kind of being coached along in that way. But if Job curses God, he separates himself from God. Like, as I said a moment ago, he absolves himself from that relationship. I am no longer your servant. We are now enemies.
No longer an intercessor.
Therefore, no longer an intercessor. And so that essential quality of his character that is not about himself, but is a way he functions for the blessing of others, is missing. Now, there's something, again, thinking about this in terms of the literature and the history of Israel. What is Israel's role given in the law before the rest of the world? What is Israel to be to the rest of the world? What's their calling?
They were the sons of God.
You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, set apart for the salvation of the Gentiles. And especially when you get into the later prophets, into Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah, the prophecies will come in that it was your task that all the nations should come to Jerusalem and worship God there. That all the nations should be grafted in. And so Israel is meant to be the mediator through which the blessings of God are dispensed to everyone around them. If they will remain faithful in the face of testing, in the face of the temptation to go after the gods of the other nations, to try to reach after their stature, their military prowess, their wealth, their riches, whatever it happens to be. If they will remain faithful in the face of their testing, then they will be the intercessors, the mediators that reconcile the nations to God. And so we see here that Job is functioning paradoxically as a microcosm of the nation of Israel. If he comes through the test, and again, remember, we know this because we're standing back. We're not in the story. We can see it from the bigger perspective. We can see it from the vantage point of a reader who knows how it begins and how it ends. You know, we can skip on a few pages and see what's going to happen next. And so we see that if he comes through that test, he will be the means by which his satanic comforters are reconciled to God. They will be grafted in and blessed by his intercession if he passes the test. If he comes through the temptation to curse God, to break that relationship in the same way that Israel would break that relationship by going after idols. And so again, on the level of what's happening beneath the surface here, he is functioning as a microcosm of the nation of Israel.
So, why does the church think that God would want to keep testing people? Why does he need that?
Why does God need that?
I mean, why?
Well, Job actually asked that question. He does. He says, I don't know if I can find the passage where he actually says that, but he asks the question, why do you do these things to me? Why don't you just take care of me? So.
And he doesn't get a satisfactory answer. I mean, there are lots of answers that we can give to that question. One of them goes back to the beginning, that the way you differentiate between a blessed man and simply a man who's good at managing his money and resourceful is in the act of testing. It is testing that reveals the character of a man, that reveals whether a person is faithful to God or not. And so, on some level, that's how it's demonstrated. That's how we know it ourselves. That's how we know what we are.
Because to me it would seem that that part isn't about God at all. That the relationship between God and man, that there's too much anthropomorphism in this. well, God must feel this, God must think that.
And I think you're right that it's not about God at all. God doesn't need it.
No, right. That's. I mean, the way this comes across, it's as if
Right.
God and Satan are having this.
Well, and on one level they definitely are. But that's part of the literary drama or the theater of the story, is that on some level, this is God having an enormous joke at Satan's expense and holding him up to humiliation. And again, that's a literary quality.
Because I would just assume get rid of the first and last part and just.
Well, that would make it a lot. That would make it a lot more. That would make it a lot easier.
That's the real
How does Job respond to his physical suffering?
Wishes he had not been born.
I wish I'd never been born. It would have been better that I had never entered into my mother's womb. This is the worst. I cannot possibly be in greater anguish than I am right now. Everything is terrible. Everything is terrible. Anybody who's ever suffered the loss of a loved one, particularly an unexpected or tragic loss, when, the loss of a child or of someone young, or in a really sudden or violent way, killed by a drunk driver or something, will experience a similar crisis. Not simply of faith, but of an existential crisis. Of wishing I had never been. I would rather be dead or never to have been born than to go through this pain. And on a pedagogical level, Job shows you that it's okay to go there. And maybe for us who are part of a tradition that articulates suffering really well, and deals with death in a really holistic kind of way, that it seems curious that you need to point that out. But if you pay much attention to what goes on in the way that the world around us treats death and suffering, it becomes very clear, particularly among certain stripes of Christians, for whom it is verboten to ever suggest anything less than fluffy, happy feelings about God. God is all, sunshine and unicorns and rainbows, and you would never, ever, be so impious as to say that you wish you hadn't been born, or that you're upset with God, or that you demand an audience. I want an explanation. And that Job does all of that. I want an explanation, and I'm going to sit here till I get one.
That's Bildad, actually. That's what Bildad says. He says, in chapter 8, he says, "How long will you speak such things? Your utterances are a mighty wind. Will God pervert the right? Will the Almighty pervert justice?" So he's just like that. He says, you can't say that stuff. That's bad.
You can't say that stuff to God. You can't talk to him that way. And Job's like, I'm doing it. And again, this, on a pedagogical level, what is this story teaching us? It's shaping the way that we can approach tragedy ourselves.
Well, I like Father Patrick mentions the Christ on the cross. Why hast thou forsaken me? That's your Christological warrant for this too.
Yep. Christ on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me, is a Christological echo of the same thing. And there again, there's no divine explanation for it coming. There's no voice from heaven at that point saying, here's the whole reason why I have done things this way so that you will understand.
That comes later. God's
Well,
plan,
God,
remember?
and the explanation doesn't come as an explanation. It comes as seeing what God does next, and how it restores, and how it brings something good out of something that seems terrible. so again, this is functioning on a lot of different levels, but it's interesting to see how it's coaching us in our approach to suffering, and how it's making room for those seemingly impious thoughts. And again, Job does a very good job of drawing the line. He never curses God. He never sunders that relationship. But he definitely invites God to enter into his anxiety and his frustration about the relationship, and to hear it from him. He really wants to make sure that God knows how he's feeling. And he communicates that real clearly.
Well, I think I taught that you can tell God you're upset and you're kind of disappointed that, okay, you killed my husband, but
Well,
but you can't say curse you God.
Again, this is one of those areas where the Orthodox tradition has internalized those senses from the texts and from the tradition, and continues to express them in a way that teaches us. But not everybody has that. In the kind of tradition that I grew up in, this would have been, more. It would have been a scandal to talk to God like this. Brother, just believe. Just keep your mouth shut and don't say anything, and you just pipe down now. Like Bildad says in chapter 8, that you quoted before. So we're being shaped in a certain way here in how we deal with these things.
Father, can I ask you along those lines, where do we see in the lives of the saints or in other? I can't say that I recall seeing that kind of talk outside of this book of the Bible in our tradition. Where am I missing? What am I missing?
Oh, you mean, are you speaking specifically of the apostolic and post-apostolic period?
Correct.
Oh, well, it's interesting. With the death and resurrection, what you find more often with having an eschatological horizon changes the way they approach it. At least the saints. They tend to approach suffering and death from the vantage point of, look, you can't change my mind by doing any of these terrible things to me, or doing them to, this weekend we're celebrating Sophia and her daughter's faith, hope, and love. And they were all martyred there in order to get them to recant. Who can possibly imagine watching one's children be killed and facing that the way that she does? And yet, their hope, their absolute confidence in the resurrection and the victory of Christ over death was such that it overwhelmed even their fear of death and their grief at losing their loved ones. So the eschatological horizon tends to overtake, particularly in the lives of the saints, this other way of approaching things, this way of dealing with suffering and death. I think they simply exist side by side.
I wanted to ask before about, in relation to the question about what about the kids that have already died. I mean, the reading this sort of phenomenologically, the phenomenology of grief, how we actually experience grief, as opposed to thinking specifically about real people as a story, the same, the experience of feeling sundered from God, feeling that wanting death, even as one refuses to give up on God. That would forgive me. I don't have a question. I'm just riffing here.
That's okay.
Not in the lives of the saints, but what I keep thinking of whenever I read Job is I think of the parable of the man born blind, the story of the man born blind, because to me that's a Christian answer to this whole problem is who sinned? Who was it? This man who sinned, and that's why he's blind, or was it his parents who sinned? And so that's a place in the New Testament where people are asking the same question that Job's asking.
the closest I can get, I think, to answering your question is in the experience that we read about in people like the Arseni books from the Gulag or the camps, when these figures who may go on to be saints, or even ones who are holy but not sainted, like Father George Calciu, Father Roman Braga, they experience, and they write about this, that
Thank you. That's right.
that sense of devastation that comes from their experiences, and it's very much a Job-like kind of a setting. We're out of time now, which means that you have a leg up on the next week, because chapter 3 you've already prepared for, and we weren't able to get to it. So next week, since you've already prepared for chapter 3, and you have done all the reading, we will read 4, 5, 6, and 7. 4 through 7. We'll read that for next week. And if you don't know the story of Job very well, I encourage you to read the chapter of the book of Job that goes with the chapter of this book side by side. And that will give you a much greater familiarity with what's going on here. So read them together if you don't know it well. And we will pick up next Saturday at 4:30 with chapters 4 through 7. God bless you all.
Okay, thank you.
And you